And now we shall go to learn something. At this special ceremony, it's my great pleasure to introduce the main speaker of today, Professor Jean-Pierre Leman, who will talk about changes in Europe and the world, an economic perspective. Professor Leman is Emeritus Professor at IMD Lausanne. The ones who come more often to our school, and there are quite some in this room, they know that we work very well with IMD Lausanne, that we were bringing many professors from there here. And first professors, our first international professors were Jean-Pierre Leman and Helmut Schütte. And they were at this time, in '86, when I went to invite them, they were at INSEAD, at the other excellent business school. So Professor Leman is really for years connected with us. And last year he was talking at Bled Strategic Forum, and it was so good that they invited him this year for a bigger group back. He is a founder of the Evian group of industrialists. This is a very strong group. And he is also, I forgot to say, honorary professor at our school. He is currently visiting professor at Faculty of Business and Economics at Hong Kong University. But his academic career has been particularly involvement with Asia. He also speaks Japanese. And overall theme he is primarily working on now is Asia in the new global disorder. You know, it can be disorder or order. Focusing mainly on East and South Asia. He is the author of several books and numerous articles. His latest book, co-edited with his son, Fabrice Leman, is Peace and Prosperity Through World Trade, meeting at the 2019 Challenge, published at Cambridge University Press. I have to say that something personal, that when we organize our seminars for the top managers of British aerospace, we had already 14 seminars, we always bring them to Sarajevo, because we are really believing in our school in experiential learning, in meeting politicians, business people, artists, people from the street and talking with them and learning from them and going home enriched. We talk about education with impact. And because of that, we can today compete with some of the most well-known business schools around the world. Then Professor Leman got the idea that also MBA students, they were 93, would come to Sarajevo and to Slovenia, of course, to have similar seminar. And we had them there 4 years in a row, and he was there, and I was with them, and they prepared for their government some plans on public-private partnerships, on privatization, on marketing of eventual Olympic Games, you know, the new ones, etc. So what I really appreciate with from Professor Leman is his eagerness to, with his knowledge, to make an impact for the better world. As Ban Ki-moon is saying, for the future we want. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Danica, I think, knows that she's probably one of the 5 persons that I most admire. I've had the pleasure, honor, privilege of knowing her, as she said, since 1986. And I was commenting yesterday, I was speaking to the young Bled Strategic Forum, saying that when I met her, and if she'd said to me, you know, in 20 years' time, 15 years' time, I'm going to have this school, and it's going to be doing this, that, and the other thing, and I would have said, keep dreaming. And in fact, it's a realization of a dream. It is absolutely, I know the world of business schools, what has been achieved is remarkable. And I said yesterday also that in this disorder, the world we live in, Bled stands out as a haven, as a sort of microcosm of what globalization should be. And I said, in fact, and now I've had the great pleasure and honor of meeting the mayor of Bled, who's informed me that it's not only a beautiful place, but with a fascinating narrative. And I said yesterday that we shouldn't be talking about the globalization of Bled, but the Bledization of the globe. So that's the next challenge that's lying ahead. What I propose to do in my few minutes here is to put this in a sort of global context, to put Europe in global context and put the globe in Europe context over a period of about 200 years in a few minutes. Winston Churchill said, the further back you look, the further forward you can see. And I think at this particular juncture, it's important to have a perspective of transformation, of change, and that goes back. Let me take you back quickly first to 1820. 200 years ago. In 1820, Europe, and this is all of Europe, corresponded to roughly 20% of global GDP and about 20% of global population. In 1820, Asia was roughly 60% of global GDP and about 60% of global population. China alone was 33% and India about 25%. So that was in 1820, not that long ago. By 1913, 100 years ago, Europe had catapulted to 35% of global GDP and just over 20% of global population. North America, which had been marginal until then, corresponded to 15%. Hence, the West, the Atlantic, by 100 years ago, corresponded to 50% of global GDP. So, Asia, in 1913, was 20% of global GDP. So you have a total reversal of fortune from 60% to 20%, from 20% to 60%. And China had been reduced from 33% to about 6%. So the narrative of the 19th and 20th centuries is the rise of Europe and the huge decline of Asia. Asia came to be synonymous with poverty and backwardness. Until fairly recently, in 1968, a Nobel Prize winning in economics, Gunnar Myrdal, a Swede, wrote a 3-volume book called The Asian Drama. And the subtitle was An Inquiry into Nations of Poverty. When I was working in Southeast Asia, also in the 1960s, this was in Malaysia, they used to say that heaven is to have a British home, a Japanese wife, a Chinese cook, and an American salary. And that hell was to have a Japanese house, a British cook, an American wife, and a Chinese salary. And this was this connotation, if you like, of Asia equals poor. In the first, there's a lot of literature, as you know, coming out now on 1913. One that I very much recommend is a book by Charles Emerson, and it's called 1913, The World Before the Great War. And the first chapter, the first part of the book, is entitled The Center of the Universe, which of course was Europe. And in the first paragraph he writes, a European could survey the world in 1913 as the Greek gods might have surveyed it from the snowy heights of Mount Olympus, themselves above, the teeming earth below. In John Maynard Keynes' book on the consequences of the peace in Paris, he described the world before World War I, and saying the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment and by the same means adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world and share without exertion or even trouble in their prospective fruits and advantages. He could secure forthwith, if he wished it, cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or other formality. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement. This was the world 100 years ago. And we're reminded when we read Keynes that at one time economists knew how to write properly. When we had the last occasion I was in Bled, there was a group of Dutch executives who had come over and had spent a few days in Sarajevo. And they arrived on Sunday evening from Sarajevo to Ljubljana, and I was teaching them on Monday morning in Bled. And the title I'd been giving was What's Happening in the World, Impact on Europe. And I asked these executives, I said, look, if we'd had this meeting in 1913 instead of 2013, how would the title be different? And of course the answer is that the title then would have been What's Happening in Europe, Impact on the Rest of the World. A gunshot in the streets of Sarajevo on 26 June 2014 precipitated ultimately the entire planet into war. What may be surprising is that in spite of the various catastrophes in Europe, including 2 world wars, revolutions and civil war, the shares of global GDP did not change that much. In 1950, Europe corresponded to about 25% of global GDP, the USA another 25%, and all of Asia 16%. So it had further declined, of course. And China was at that point about 3% of global GDP. In 1975, Europe and the US about the same. Asia had increased to 23%, but half of that was Japan. So the rest of Asia was still reasonably backward. So throughout the 20th century, globalization, West was in the driving seat. We had what you could call, until fairly recently, a hub and spokes world economy, with the OECD at the hub and the rest of the world the spokes. And so this was the center of the global economy. And until about the beginning of this century, this hub corresponded to about 85% of everything. 85% of trade, 85% of the investment, 85% of patent applications, and so on. And so what we're living through now, and as we speak, is extremely profound, transformative global discontinuities. The world is changed dramatically in a way that it hadn't for over 200 years at least. And what are the driving forces of these transformations? I think first and foremost is the Chinese globalization revolution. Let me go back even a few more centuries. In the early 15th century, a very famous Chinese general, well, he's famous, he's not famous, he was famous at the time, called Zheng He, had gone around about the world, fantastic sort of navigational discoveries and so on. And he came back, and the Ming Emperor in 1433 decided to stop foreign voyages. So China in 1433 started looking inwards. And this then led to the Portuguese seaborne empire. And this inward-lookingness of China continued through the centuries, including with Mao Zedong. In 1978-79, with very few of us aware of the importance at the time, China underwent dramatic change. In the words of Zheng Bijian, who's a leading Chinese reformer and economist, and I quote him, he says, "The most important strategic choice the Chinese made was to embrace economic globalization rather than detach themselves from it." And it was absolutely extraordinary. I was going a lot to China at this time. There was a sudden sort of desire to learn, to look upon globalization, to embrace it. Jonathan Fenby, who's a specialist of China, in a book wrote, he said, in 1949, Mao changed China. In 1979, Deng changed the world. The former Director General of UNCTAD, and before that of the WTO, Supachai Panichpakdi, is a Thai, said whether it's looking out over the next few years or the next quarter century, how the world's most populous country handles the many developmental challenges it faces will go a long way toward determining what kind of world we inhabit. Pick an issue: the environment, the military, international affairs, or the global economy. China's choices will have a major impact on Asia and the world. If China makes the wrong decisions, the results will be chilling, not only for the country's 1.3 billion citizens, but for many people beyond its borders as well. Conversely, a China that successfully makes the transformation to a relatively affluent, open society will be both an inspiration to other countries and a locomotive that will help to power the world's economies. So we live increasingly in what you could call a sinocentric world. The center of the universe has moved east quite dramatically. Second driving force that occurred was this global market revolution. Again, it's quite extraordinary. In the period of the early 1990s, you saw a whole series of reforms which led to countries getting into the global market economy. So if you take, for example, about 1990, the number of people in the world who were engaged in the global market economy were about 850 million, not quite a billion. And this was mainly Europe, North America, Australia, Japan, and so on and so forth. Now it's calculated it's about 6 billion. So this has been a tremendous, tremendous, tremendous change that's gone on. You had the implosion of the Soviet Empire, the end of the Second World, reforms in India in 1991, reforms in Mexico joins NAFTA, South Africa abandons apartheid. And perhaps one of the most interesting countries I happen to know quite well is Vietnam. Vietnam started having reforms in the 1990s. The boat people who had left in the 1960s and 70s started coming back. It's a highly entrepreneurial society. It's very much part of the global economy. And what I was thinking when I was in Vietnam, some of you old enough may remember that when the Americans were fighting in Vietnam, there was what they called the domino theory. That if Vietnam falls to communism, then so will Thailand, so will Indonesia, so will Malaysia, so will Switzerland, and so on. And so what you had to do was to stop the domino. And what we're seeing now is a reverse domino theory. In other words, that countries, in the latest is Myanmar, coming and joining in the global market economy, which is dramatically changing. Then, what we have to consider also, a third major driving force, are the combination of demographics and economics. One of the forces that one's seeing is massive urbanization and the rise of a middle-income group. In China, it's expected by the end of this decade, there will be approximately 1 billion people who will be middle-income earners. The whole of Asia, by the 2030 or thereabouts, about 3 billion. Mike Spence, the Nobel Prize winner, has talked about what he calls the next convergence. The tendency in the world has been that you've had about 15% of people who've been rich and 85% of the people who've been poor with various degrees. He says now we're moving to an 85% to 15%, and 85% as the message from the Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the UN, was saying, we're seeing the end of poverty. This is part of the good news and the rise of these middle-income earners. And it's having an absolutely huge impact. I was in Venice last year for the first time since 2005 with one of my granddaughters. And I don't know if you've been there recently. It was full of Chinese. It's full of Chinese. Piazza San Marco is, and a lot of the restaurants now, expensive restaurants, have the menus in Chinese. When we went to Murano, they have some signs on the doors of the shops selling glass, saying this is authentic Murano-made glass, not cheap Chinese imitations. And my granddaughter asked me, but aren't the Chinese going to be offended by that? And I said, but it's in Italian and English. It's not in Chinese, but the menus are in Chinese. So, I live in Lausanne. There's the International Olympic Committee, the Olympic Museum, full of Chinese. And, one of the problems that I have is that and in fact, the other day, I live in Lausanne, and when I'm traveling around, people say, where do you live? Switzerland. Where in Switzerland? Lausanne. Oh, yeah, I've been there. It's beautiful. It's got this medieval bridge that goes through. I said, no, that's Lucerne, not Lausanne. But the Chinese know where Lausanne is because, of course, it's the International Olympic Committee. But I went to Lucerne, which I don't go to very often. I don't know if you've been there recently. I went there a couple of years ago, and I came out of the station, and I thought I was in Mumbai. It was full of Indians. And it was obviously sort of middle-income earning Indians. I couldn't understand what they were doing in Lucerne. And in fact, the reason is that a lot of Bollywood films are made in the Lucerne area. So they come from India to go to Lucerne to see where their favorite Bollywood films making. This is part of this changing world that we're seeing. I don't know, you may remember that there was this EU-China solar panel dispute and the Chinese retaliated by saying they were going to investigate subsidies being given to wine. China is Bordeaux's biggest market. I live in France, not far from Cognac, and they also looked to China because if the Chinese stopped drinking cognac, there wouldn't be any more cognac. So this is just to illustrate that in many respects, Asia is becoming the center of the universe, but also at the same time to recognize that just like Europe in 1913, there's many fault lines, turbulences, and disputes. And so when I'm doing this project and saying Asia and the new global disorder, it's open question. I think one of the things that we can be quite certain of is that Europe will not go to war again, no matter how bad things turn out. Not like we've seen in 1914 or 1939. Asia, you know, there's lots of things, and it's not just growing economies, there's territorial disputes. You see what's going on between China and Japan right now. I don't think either Beijing or Tokyo want to go to war, but as we know, wars happen sometimes by accident. And if you have the circumstances. So, you know, when I say it's the center of the universe, I'm not proposing that it's paradise. It's not the center of paradise. It's the center of the universe. So in the meantime, if we're talking about this sort of Asian century, what about Europe? And I haven't given up on Europe at all. I'm European. I have 7 grandchildren who are European. And I think we need to give serious thought to how Europe is going to adjust to. The world is not going to adjust to Europe. Europe has got to adjust to the world. And this, I don't think, has penetrated the mentalities of many of our leaders. They still go on thinking we're living as we were in 1913. And this has to change. Europe's weight in the global economy is bound to decline. That's inevitable. Whether we have low growth, middle growth, high growth, the weight of the European economy. And among other things, this will be driven by demographics. As I said, in 1913, we were about 22% of world population. And this is all of Europe. This is taking Russia, Central Asia, Turkey, etc., into consideration. Now we're at about 12%. Projections for 2050, it will be about 7%. So, you know, we're getting smaller. We're going back a little bit to what our historical perspective was, this corner out there. So, what are some of the things that we should do? Firstly, face reality. We are going to be declining, and we've got to take advantage, recognize that it's our turn to adjust. I think there's tremendous amount of room for social innovation. We can reduce our standard of living, material standard of living. There's a lot of scope in Europe for improving our spiritual and cultural and artistic and so on and so forth standard of living, and scientific and educational. I mean, Europe still has a tremendous amount of soft power. You know, at IMD we get a lot of Asian students, and many of them say, well, we'd rather stay here rather than go back to Beijing or whatever. Avoid Fortress Europe syndrome. That would really be terrible. It's sort of closing in on ourselves, and I'm afraid that there's a tendency of that in the Commission. Be outward looking. Engage with Asia. Languages, learning, investment, trade, R&D. There's lots of opportunities for young Europeans. One of the things that really encourages me is, as I'm walking around in the streets of Shanghai, Beijing, Mumbai, whatever, the number of young Europeans who've come there, they're European, but they're taking advantage. In some cases working for high salaries, in some cases. Do you know that, for example, Beijing today has a European artistic population of artists estimated at about 10,000. So these are people, take their brushes with them, their paints, and they go off and do their things, and they're very happy. And you find this. This is something that we have to positively encourage to engage with, particularly the new generations. The other one is also that we should learn from Japan. Japan is the only Asian country that succeeded in the European-driven globalization. Japan's a great success story, or at least was in the 19th century. What did the Japanese do that made them adjust and win in the European globalization that we might consider doing? The other thing is also that, as I say, Europe still has a tremendous amount of soft power. We should, I think I coined the term, I was saying that Europe has the capacity to deploy weapons of mass seduction. Not weapons of mass destruction, but weapons of mass seduction. That we can still contribute very much to improving the state of the world on environmental issues, cultural issues, etc. There is, as I say, a tremendous scope for that. But then the major project I think we should work on, and this is where I hope to be able to go more often to Russia and Central Asia now. So I think we're making a number of mistakes, particularly on the global economic order front. The proposed Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, in my opinion, is a huge mistake. It's doing exactly what we shouldn't be doing. We're looking this way, whereas in fact all of the action's over here. I don't worry about it too much because it's going to fail. I mean, every sort of trade initiative. But what I have proposed is that we should start thinking in terms of a Eurasian free trade agreement, linking the two extremes of the continent and engaging very much with Russia and Central Asia to sort of recreate a different kind of space that will give us a sort of tremendous amount of potential in terms of a role in the economies of the 21st century. About 10 years ago, I was at a meeting in Dubai, and the chairman of Emirates Airlines was explaining how they were inaugurating flights that were going to be flying from Dubai to Buenos Aires and Dubai to Sao Paulo. So they had flights of people going from Mumbai to Dubai to Sao Paulo, or from Beijing or Shanghai to Dubai to Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, etc. I listened to this absolutely fascinated, and I went home and I went to YouTube and I put on Bob Dylan's song, The Times They Are Changing. Because up until then, it was impossible for somebody from Mumbai to go to Sao Paulo without going via the West, either via Frankfurt or via Los Angeles. And this is what then I said, this is the end of the hub and spokes. This is where a lot of the growth now is taking place south-south. And here again, it's a question of adjustment, of getting into part of that action. Again, another just brief anecdote. I joined IMD in 1997. In 1998, I was sent to give a series of presentations in Brazil, the first one in Sao Paulo, on China and globalization in the 21st century. And I remember when I was introduced at this first meeting, the chair, the Brazilian, said, "Thank you much, Jean-Pierre, for coming. Of course, you must realize that for us, China is very remote." In 1998, Brazilian-Chinese trade was about this much. Now it's about this much. It's the biggest trading partner, and it's impossible to go to Sao Paulo without having a conversation on China within the first 5 minutes. So the times they are changing, but they're, again, exciting times, and there's no reason for Europe to be depressed, as long as we face reality. And I conclude with a quotation from Darwin, which you probably know, but it's important constantly to remind ourselves of it. When he wrote, he said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change." And I think that's really what we have to do is to face reality, recognize that this change is taking place, and see what our competitive advantages might be. And I'm absolutely convinced that the Bled Strategic Forum will be seen as one of the inputs to bringing this transformation about, to facing reality, and to ensuring, as I keep on saying, please, 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 don't be French. Look out, not in. Thank you very much.
Thank you.